Hi, I'm Mateusz from Randomly Generated Colors, and today we will paint a gambler character from Etherfields, the board game. This video will be split into 3 parts. First, piece analysis and color choices. Second, color blocking and washing. And third, the biggest one, volume building, textures and details. Also, I strongly recommend watching episode 0 of this series, where I talk about preparations, tools, brushes and color mixing. Part 1. Color choices. So first, let's take a look at this artwork. We have her jacket, which is made of some brown leather. So I'm going to use reddish brown. Kimera red oxide should be fine, but in example Dumbled brown from Citadel is very similar. Also, you can easily get this color by mixing a lot of red with green. Her skirt looks like white with a yellowish tint. I'm going to mix a lot to get this color, but as a base of it I will use yellow oxide from Kimera, which is very similar to Nemesis Desert from Citadel. You will also get this color by adding a tiny bit of violet or dark blue to the pure yellow color. She also has this turquoise piece of fabric on her skirt. To get this color I'm going to mix green with blue. I'm not sure how dark it will get, so I will use normal and navy blue, and also normal and dark green. Here I recommend you to experiment yourself, but the stronger colors you will use, the better. Her feathery tail is yellow with some orange here and there. You will find me having some problems with finding proper color, but I will mostly use cold yellow from Kimera. But any strong yellow would do. She has Caucasian skin color, but I'm not using any specific product. I will mix it myself. For that mix, you will need reddish brown, the one used for a jacket would be fine, white, and maybe some yellow. Finally, she has this breastplate, which I'm going to paint with metallic steel paint, and some jewelry which I'm going to paint gold, which will also be useful to paint the base. Other than that, we will need black and white paints. For white I'm using cold white tone, which has a tiny bit of blue in it. Also, ultra matte varnish will be super useful for mixing and sealing. I will also use some inks and ready washes. You might also want to check a description of this video. I am listing all the paints, materials and useful links there. Part 2. First layers and washing. I started by painting colors I mixed onto the figure, to check out if they work together and are similar to the artwork. First I put the colors I picked on my wet palette, so I can use them anytime I want, and some glaze medium to thin them down if necessary. I used it in a first step already to thin down yellow oxide a little bit, and painted with it all the tails and a tiny wing on her right shoulder. I wasn't very precise, I just wanted to cover all the areas. I was also hoping that my zenithal base coat will be visible from underneath it, at least a little. For the skirt, I knew I will need to mix yellow with white, but I had a feeling that there is a tiny bit of green as well. I mixed all those colors and applied them to the mini. Afterward, I mixed in some black and painted it underneath the skirt, so it will look like it's hidden in the shadow. Finally, I added some more white to the first mix and painted over the lace material in the front. Painting with such bright colors might be problematic. They usually have poor coverage or end up chalky. My recommendation here is to start with very thin layers and in time learn what consistency works best for you. Also, shading this kind of material is very problematic, but we will get there later on. Next I mixed some red oxide with black to get a jacket color. The proportion was about 4 red to 1 black, but just try adding one to another until you get what you like. I thinned it down and applied it on a mini. This time I wanted it to be semi-translucent, so I can see some undercoat. I started by painting the borders between different colors with precision. And then I filled the rest of the area. But don't stress yourself too much. If you messed up, take some of the paint we used in previous steps and fix it. Later on, I also noticed that I forgot the boots, but I just used the same color to fill them in. Now to the turquoise. I mixed navy blue and dark green on my palette. When I felt I'm close, I checked out how the thin layer looks nearby. My first try was too blue, so I just added more green. When I was satisfied, I simply applied it on the mini the same way as in previous steps. Next I'm going to do something that might be controversial for some of you. I'm going to mix a skin color by myself. If you fancy ready products, just use them. I prefer to mix my own, so I have more control over the highlights and shadow colors. I started by adding a lot of white to red oxide. Then I also added some yellow oxide to the mix, and in 2 steps I got my base color. I simply filled all the skin area with it. Again, watching out not to touch areas I already painted. Next I painted the breastplate black. When it was drying, I added more black to red oxide, diluted it by much, and applied this mixture similar to wash onto the base. After that, I added my metallic paint to the palette and painted the breastplate with the steel color. As you can see, I left some crevices back. It is intentional, but I'm not stressing out too much if I miss one or two. They will just produce better contrast later on. Then I painted her necklace and brooch gold, and I used the same color on all elements of the base that weren't looking like leaves. For those, I used green. Now, in my opinion, the next step is not necessary, but it helps with understanding of the volumes and adds some texture. Also, if you want to paint the mini fast, you might just finish it after this. I'm going to wash this mini with a few different colors of washes. You can use ready products here, or just mix them from inks or paints we already used. All ways are fine, and I will show you basically all of them. Just pick and choose. One tip here, don't use your best brush in this step. For feathers I used Citadel Sepia shade. It is basically yellow oxide with a tint of red. I added it to my palette and diluted a little bit, because for my taste it is too strong right from the bottle. Then I profusely applied it on a gambler's tail. Next I mixed it with Citadel Camoshade, which is a green wash, and diluted it even more, so it won't stain a light skirt too much. As you can see, I applied quite much of it, but after a moment I used a dry brush to soak excess paint from crevices. If you won't do that, it will simply look dirty when it dries. Next I made a wash from black paint. This time I used Ultra Matte Varnish as a diluent, because I'm going to paint over metallics, and I want to kill some of its shine for now. And yes, null oil would be fine here as well, but not the glossy one. I applied this mix over the breastplate and all the leathery parts. As for other parts, I added some black to turquoise to make a wash for the upper skirt, and some black to red oxide to make a wash for a skin. For the latter, Rakeland Flesh shade from Citadel would work fine. Lastly, I added even more black for the last mix, and added it to the gold parts on the base. Finally, I let it dry. Half an hour should be enough, but in my case I came back next day. Part 3. Volume building, textures and details. Now the washes are dry and almost half of my work is done. If you fancy this fast result, you might leave it here or just pick only a few details from the rest of the video. Okay, let's start by building some light and shadows. I started with the skirt. For now I feel it should be closer to the white color. First I felt a need to separate this frill from the rest of the skirt. So I painted the recesses with some yellow mixed with a tiny bit of black. I was very precise here, drawing a very thin line. Next I mixed yellow oxide with white and started painting the areas facing up with thin layers. So on her knee, frills, and other reason areas. The paint is diluted and I'm trying to get only a little of it on a brush, thus avoiding overflowing details. After that, I added even more white and painted just the knee and thigh and most recent up-facing areas. Next, the turquoise fabric. I felt it needs way more contrast and it should look shinier. I added some black to the mix from before and painted all the flat areas and recesses, but leaving the edges. Next I added some white to the previous mix and painted resin areas, but I felt the color isn't saturated enough, so I added some light blue and green, and painted a little smaller areas again. It might seem an unnecessary burden, but I added some white and painted this fabric 2 more times, first only on the edges, and second only on some parts, usually in the middle. It's just not that much work, but it will help to create a shiny appearance in the second. The last step I did was to use a very first mix and dilute it heavily to create a filter or glaze, and I painted all over the fabric. This step will do 2 things. saturate the color, and smoothen out color transitions just a little bit. This is a very typical technique for me, and a reason I told you that the washing step might be unnecessary. Now I did basically the same thing with the jacket and boots, but instead of white I added yellow oxide to the previous mix. The second lighter layer was applied on the top of the up-facing parts or middles of the curves, in example, the middle of her back. After that, I again made a filter, but this time using Sepia ink and ultramatte varnish. You can also mix it, adding blue to the mix you used for highlights and diluting it. Now let me show you a trick to my metallics. I already have one layer of metallics and a wash on this breastplate. When I came back to it, I used the same metallic paint, but this time only on the edges and up-facing areas. And a black wash with ultramatte varnish again. After it was dry, I came back with metallic paint, but this time I painted only middles of the edges with the side of my brush. This way I have a metal that reflects only a little light, mostly on the details, and has a nice contrast and gradient of colors. If I painted it just shiny, I believe it would steal all the attention of the viewer. When it comes to gold, I use basically the same technique, but I washed it with sepia ink mixed with an ultramatte varnish. Okay, I didn't like my first approach to feathers, so I decided to start over. I basically painted all of them except Raches's with yellow oxide. Then I added some black to it and painted down-facing parts. In the vertical areas, I painted only thin layers in recesses. I also used this color to paint both sides of Raches's with a very thin line. Next, I mixed cold yellow with yellow oxide and painted up-facing parts. In case of the vertical areas, I painted only thin lines. And on up-facing ones, I only avoided recesses. Finally, I mixed in some white, and with a fine brush I painted some thin lines on the topmost feathers, to add a final highlight. I've spent quite some time on the feathers, but I feel it will be the first thing the viewer will look at, so it should be done really well. Thus I spent the most energy on it. Now the skin. And I must say sorry to all of you, but the footage of this stage was a little crappy. I recorded it in daylight and didn't change my camera settings. Okay, do you remember this first mix we used for our skin color? We will start with it now. First, there are some areas on our body that have a warmer color, cause there is a lot of veins underneath the skin, like knees, elbows or ears. For these areas I mixed in a tiny bit of red oxide, but you can use just red. Then I added some white and painted highlights. For all other areas I just stuck with the base, more pale color, and highlighted it with white. In downward facing areas I just added a tiny bit of black to the mix. Okay, the footage of painting of the face was even worse, so let me show you a few things on the photos. First I added some shadows with reddish color we used for knees in the areas under her cheekbones, brows, lips and nose. Next I used a base color again, but this time to paint the upper and lower lip, chin, forehead and cheeks. Also I tried to mix those two colors in between all the areas, so the tint is a little different everywhere. Now with a tiny bit of white added to the mix, I painted nose, chin and forehead. I also painted the upper lip, but I tried to leave a darker line near the cheek. As for eyes, I mixed some blue to the eye socket and then painted a dark spot with a very dark brown. You probably should avoid pure black here. Finally, I added a tiny dot of white to simulate a reflection. For such a tiny figure, I believe it is more than enough. As for the hair, I painted it with a black color mixed with some red oxide and highlighted it by mixing some yellow oxide. I placed reflections on the upper side of her short hair and on the top of the wave on the long hair. On the side with a longer hair, I also added some turquoise we used for the skirt. Finally, the base. I already told you I painted gold parts, but in the case of the base I skipped the final highlights. I want it to look dirty and not so interesting that the viewer will focus on it instead of the miniature. The leaves were painted basically the same way as leather or fabric. I highlighted green by mixing in some yellow and painted the edges and up-facing surfaces. After 2 or 3 steps, I made a wash from dark green ink and ultramatte varnish and painted all over it to get a nice transitions. I finished up by painting the base rim black and sealing a mini with varnishes. As it is a gaming piece, I used polyurethane varnish on the surface. I assume players will touch most of the time. And after it was dry, I used ultramatte varnish over the whole figure apart from the metallic parts. Okay, so here is a finished Gambler. Painting her took me about 4 or 5 hours, but I've spent way too long on the yellow tail, until I got what I wanted. I'm also very happy that I was able to match an artwork so closely. So this is the end of this episode, probably the longest so far. I plan to publish the next one in 2 weeks, so if you don't want to miss it, you might consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye!